Today, we're going to talk about one of the most difficult and morally complex subjects of the Holocaust. This is the story of the Sonderkommando, the men who were forced to become eyewitnesses at the very center of the Nazi extermination machine. Their story is one of unimaginable horror, for sure, but it's also about profound human resilience and this desperate, desperate need to bear witness. I want you to just start with this impossible question. Really think about it. This isn't some hypothetical exercise. It was the daily reality for a group of prisoners in Auschwitz. They faced a choice that is almost beyond our comprehension. And their story, it really forces us to confront the absolute limits of human endurance and morality. So who exactly were the Sonderkommando? The name translates to special squads. And in a place like Auschwitz-Birkenau, these were units made up almost entirely of Jewish male prisoners. Their job? They were forced to manage the industrial process of mass murder. Specifically, everything that happened after the people were killed in the gas chambers. They were prisoners, but they were also forced to be instruments in the destruction of their own people. To even begin to understand their situation, we have to wrap our heads around this fundamental, tragic paradox that defined every single moment of their lives. This right here, this is a truly horrifying piece of logic. The Sonderkommando were kept alive only as long as they were useful. And what made them useful? The constant arrival of more transports of Jews to be murdered. You see, if the killing machine slowed down, it meant their own extermination was just around the corner. So their survival, day by day, literally depended on the murder of others. Now, these experiences aren't just abstract historical facts. They belong to real people. People like Joseph Sakar, a Greek Jew who was forced into the Sonderkommando in 1944. He was one of the very, very few who survived, and his testimony is just a vital window into what really happened inside those crematoria. Sakar's own words, they just perfectly capture the lifelong burden of being a survivor. This quote gets right to the heart of the trauma, that sheer disbelief of having lived through something so horrific. A memory that, of course, never fades. It was a reality he questioned for the rest of his life. To really understand their psychological state, we first have to confront the precise nature of the work these men were forced to do. This was their daily routine. It was a methodical, factory-like process of destruction. First, they were ordered to calm the newly arrived victims, telling them they were just going to take a shower and be disinfected. After the SS released the Zyklon B gas, the Sonderkommando had to go inside, untangle the heaps of bodies, and begin the grim process of disposal, extracting gold teeth, shaving hair, and then hauling the corpses to the furnaces or to these huge open-air burning pits. And amidst all this industrial horror, there were these moments of just unbearable humanity. Joseph Sakar remembered seeing the children, completely unaware of their fate, just acting like kids do, reaching for their parents' hands, seeking comfort in their final moments. And this story, it just brilliantly illustrates the moral torment they lived with. One survivor told this story of being confronted by a little boy who actually understood what was happening. He was being judged, right there, by a child who saw him as a collaborator, a Jewish murderer. I mean, can you imagine? That accusation coming from a victim, it just highlights the impossible position they were in. So how could anyone endure this, psychologically? How did they function day after day inside this absolute hell? Well, the only way to survive was to just shut down. One account describes how their senses became dull and petrified, how every human emotion dies. You see, normal reactions like grief or pity, those were impossible luxuries. To feel was to break, so they forced themselves not to feel. Abraham Dragon gives us another crucial perspective on this. He was taken from Poland with his brother back in 1942, and his testimony really helps us understand the specific mindset you had to adopt to survive this kind of horror. Another survivor, Charles Chazan, he described this state perfectly. They became automatons, like robots. They just suppressed their emotions and thoughts so deeply that they could perform these horrific tasks without completely collapsing. It was like a form of psychological self-amputation, really, and it was absolutely necessary for survival. And yet, for all the horror, very few of these men chose suicide. And that raises a really profound question. Why? Well, for many of them, the answer was this powerful, overriding motivation, the will to survive, not just for the sake of living, but to one day be able to tell the world the truth. And this drive to survive, it wasn't just passive. It actually eventually transformed into active, armed resistance. That question seems almost ridiculous, right?
In a place of total control and dehumanization like Auschwitz, organized resistance feels impossible. And yet, it happened, planned and executed by the very prisoners who worked at the heart of the killing process.
The plan they came up with was just incredibly audacious. It involved this whole network of prisoners, including these unbelievably brave women like Rosa Robata, who worked in a nearby munitions factory. Every day they smuggled out tiny amounts of gunpowder, which was then secretly delivered to the Sonderkommando men. The men then assembled crude grenades, and the goal was to destroy the crematoria and start a camp-wide revolt. On that day, the plan went into motion. The Sonderkommando of Crematorium 4 revolted. They actually killed several SS guards, set their own workplace on fire, and blew a hole in the barbed wire fence. It was the only organized armed uprising to ever happen in Auschwitz. And even though it was ultimately suppressed, it was such a profound act of defiance. Of course, the SS retribution was brutal. Rosa Robata and 3 other women were publicly hanged for their role. But before the noose was put around her neck, Rosa managed to shout one final, defiant cry for justice and revenge. That uprising was a fight for a heroic end. But there was another fight happening, one for memory, and it was just as important. The Sonderkommando knew they were designated as secret keepers. They knew they were marked for death by the SS to eliminate all witnesses. So, fearing that the truth of Auschwitz would be literally buried with them, several prisoners, men like Zalman Gradowski and Laj Langfuss, wrote secret diaries. They put these manuscripts in jars and flasks and buried them in the ash-filled soil around the crematoria, just hoping that one day the world would find them. This quote from Abraham Dragon, it really says it all. It speaks to their ultimate purpose. Survival wasn't just about breathing for another day. It was about fulfilling this sacred duty. The need to testify, to make sure the world would know and remember, that became a motivation even more powerful than the basic instinct to live. So the Sonderkommando endured the heart of darkness so that a testimony would exist. They risked absolutely everything to bury their words in the earth, hoping that we would one day find them and listen. And that brings us to the final question, a question for all of us. Now that we have their testimony, what is our responsibility in the face of their sacrifice?